A woman reaches a certain age when someone says to her, or her inner critic says, at your age, you wouldn't, you shouldn't, you can't. Well, here on A Certain Age, we celebrate those women who should, who can, who will, and who do amazing things. Today's guest is Sarah Darer Littman. She's a critically acclaimed author of multiple young adult novels. Her books are published by Scholastic and Simon & Schuster Books. They're available online, in libraries, and in bookstores. Sarah also teaches creative writing as an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Western Connecticut State University and at the Yale Writers Workshop. She's an award-winning opinion columnist. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you have such interesting stories to tell, and I know that your books are works of fiction for young adults, but you address really serious topics. How do you make a story interesting for vulnerable kids, but still make it realistic?
So the most important thing to remember when you're writing for young adults is that the story has to come first. If you're trying to write a message book, then it's not going to be authentic. And I always say that young people have very good, I'm not sure if I can say this word on TV, but they have very good detectors of fakeness. Mm-hmm. But also I do a lot of research. Being an author is the best career possible for me because I'm an eternally curious person. And I get to think of questions and then do a lot of research to figure out the answers to them and talk to really interesting people and then write a book to sort of answer the question for myself and hopefully for others too.
So what you're looking for is something that really engages the kids, but like you said, does have a genuine message.
Yeah, it's got to be genuine,
Right.
And the message can't be the whole reason to write the book. It's got to be about the story. And sometimes it's not even like I want to give them answers, but I want to help them think about questions.
Okay, no, that's great. I think you can't talk down to kids, right? At
Exactly.
any age.
And I think part of the problem, I think, with some adults who want to write books for kids, particularly like message books, is that they underestimate teenagers. And nothing makes me more angry than people who underestimate teenagers. So if you don't respect teenagers, you shouldn't write for them. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, no, good advice, absolutely. And your books are very honest and straightforward. And one I'd love to talk about right off the bat is you talk about the threats that the internet poses because of internet predators, right? Internet
Yes.
predators are a real thing, and your book, Want to Go Private, tells a story of a teen who is approached and taken in by an internet predator. What gave you the idea for going into that topic?
Well, it was interesting because I was actually, it was the second book in a 2-book deal, and I was actually trying to write another book when a supervisory special agent from the New Haven FBI came and spoke at my son's high school about internet safety. So they had one session for the kids and then another one for parents. And after his presentation to parents, I started asking him a few questions, and he ended up telling me a story about a girl, it was a true story, a girl in Connecticut whose mom had her password, so obviously she'd had discussions about internet safety at home. And in Connecticut, we have a pretty strong internet safety curriculum in 8th grade, I think it is. So, but this girl nonetheless got involved with the predator and left with him. And by the time the police caught up with them, they were almost at the Canadian border. And that's despite mom having her passwords, so they were able to catch up with them pretty quickly. But what really made me stop him and say, there's a book in this, was her reaction when the police caught up with them. Because I would have thought it would be, oh, thank God you saved me.
Right.
But it wasn't. Her reaction was, don't hurt him. And as soon as he told me that, this like bell went off in my head. And part of it is because of that curiosity, because I had to try and understand what would make this girl who had all this, had the internet safety curriculum, whose mom had talked to her about internet safety, what brought her from all that knowledge to the point of don't hurt him. And I had to write a book to figure out the answer.
And I think you had mentioned that she's also not a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, right? This is, even in this example, she was somebody who had training, right, or understanding of the dangers.
Yes, I purposely wanted to make this character, she's very bright, her parents are still married, you know, because too often parents are like, oh, well, that only happens to those kids. And I wanted to make it clear that it could happen to any kid who is at a vulnerable moment. And then has someone basically grooming them by saying, you know, basically reflecting everything that they say back, so it makes it sound like they're the only person in the world who understands them.
Right, because you did a lot of research for this, right? So after you met this FBI agent, didn't you actually study with the FBI? And this is what you found, right? How do predators do this?
I did a lot of research on grooming. In fact, my daughter at one point said to me, you know, why is it that you have all these creepy books on your bedside table? But I have to tell you, I did not sleep a lot when I was writing this book. But I had to write to the FBI in Washington to get permission. And you know, tell them that I had a contract with Scholastic, and so then I got permission to work with the FBI in New Haven, and they were amazing. Like they really, they answered so many of my questions, and it helped me. I think that helped make the book a lot more authentic. But one of the things I learned was that real predators get very dirty very quickly, and I had to try and balance the needs of my readers with, you know, trying to tell the story accurately, but also bearing in mind that I was writing for young people.
Right. So when you say they're getting dirty, right? So they're sexually explicit on the internet.
Yes, because they get very sexually explicit very quickly because they want to. They're not just talking to one kid; they're talking to a whole bunch of kids, and they want to weed out the kids that freak out the minute they mention sex.
Interesting. So, all right, so I didn't realize this. So predators not necessarily after one person. They're just hitting all the time until somebody bites.
Yes. They're usually, I can't remember the statistic because I wrote that book a while ago, but you know, each predator is usually talking to a network of potential victims, often in different places.
Wow. And they find the one.
Yeah, and then they get one who bites, and then they draw them in.
That is so scary. And then, so staying with the idea of the internet and cyberspace, you also address cyberbullying, which is another issue that happens.
Right.
So that was in your book, Backlash. Can you tell us just a little bit about what happened and how cyberbullying, I guess it's an issue? I mean,
well, it's interesting because when I do school visits or, you know, Skype with classrooms, one of the questions I always ask is how, you know, raise your hand if someone has written something nasty about you online. And inevitably, the majority of the kids raise their hands. So it's a huge problem, but as I often tell them when they all raise their hands, I say the problem is that we as adults are not setting the example of how to behave online. And there are so many examples I could point to of that.
There's so many examples nowadays, but we'll let those examples go. But we'll let Twitter speak for itself. Right?
Exactly, but it's, you know, we as adults have to model the behavior we want to see from our kids. Like we can't say like do as I, you know.
Don't do as I do. Because I'm not
do
doing
as I say,
thing.
not as I do. Yeah. So if they see us behaving badly online, then then it normalizes it for them. But part of the reason I think I'm really interested in so much, like I think my last 5 novels have had some technology element. I'm really fascinated by the intersection of teenagerhood and technology because when I grew up, we didn't have this technology, and I often wonder how different my life would have been and how, you know, how it might have been changed by it, and I'm not sure it would have been changed for the better. I mean, I'm very grateful. I made a lot of mistakes as a teenager because that's what teenagers do.
Because you're a teenager.
Yes, exactly. It's like your brain hasn't fully developed, your frontal, and so being able to make those mistakes in a way that they're mostly sort of hazy memories in the minds a select group of childhood friends, as opposed to having every mistake blasted across the internet, from which you can never escape.
Right.
You know, that's very, it's hard for kids. And I think that also contributes to why so many young people have, you know, suicidal ideation or depression, you know, because it's very stressful for them.
I'm going to jump off topic here now, even though didn't pre-warn you, but so you just talked about the suicidal tendencies with teens. I heard on the news the other day that numbers have come up over the last few decades, that suicide is much more prevalent now. Do you think you saying that's in part because of the internet?
I believe it is because, you know, they can never turn it off. You know, before you would go to school, you might get bullied, but then you could come home and get away from it. But with cyberbullying, it's like, you know, it's every notification on your device. I mean, it's heartbreaking. Some of the stories that I've heard, or, you know, kids have written to me. I mean, one of the most amazing things as an author is when a young person writes to you and says, you know, your book changed my life, or thank you for understanding me, because they feel seen.
And have you had that in the case of anything with the internet, either predators or cyberbullying?
Yes. I mean, some of the letters I got when Want to Go Private came out made me not sleep at night, because they were, you know, kids who had been involved with predators, or what was really great, because, you know, as a teenager, you're starting to be more influenced by your peers sometimes than you are by your parents. And so a great situation, something that made me feel really good, was that a young girl had read it who was worried about her friend. And she spoke to her father about it. She was like, Dad, I think you need to read this book. And the father ended up writing to me, and they ended up, because she didn't know what to do. And so she ended up, the father ended up speaking to the parents, and but I've also had friends who said, you know, oh, my friend was speaking to this guy online, and then I gave her your book, and now she stopped, or, you know, or writing to me saying, I'm worried about my friend, and, you know, I tell them they should try and find a trusted adult to speak to, because I'm not a, you know,
right.
I you know, I'm not a police, you know, I don't have the resources to help everyone, but I can at least try and point them in the right direction.
And you bring the awareness. Right?
Yes.
So I think that's such a gift that your book brings, is someone being able to say, Dad, could you please read this?
Yes, because it's all about the conversations. It really is. And if a book can start a conversation, then that's really what it's about. That's about growth. That's about learning. And that's about being open and not being in denial.
And now, another topic that you wrote about, which I know is very near and dear to your heart, because, excuse me, it's not one that you necessarily researched, it's one that you lived.
Right.
And this book was about bulimia. It was called Purge. Can you just tell me a little bit the history? What was your experience with bulimia and mental illness?
So I suffered from depression and probably body image disorder as a teenager, but it wasn't really diagnosed. And then, so it wasn't really until I was in my 30s, and I was under a lot of stress, and I became bulimic. I was living in England at the time, and I finally got up the courage to go to see my GP, my doctor, and he, in his very English way, said, I suppose telling you to stop wouldn't help. And I'm thinking, well, if it would help, if telling me to stop would have helped, I would have told myself to stop, you know? So it wasn't really till I came back to the States, and then I was able to get treatment. But then I sort of was under increasing mental stress, and I ended up, when I was 38 years old, trying to kill myself, and ended up in Silver Hill in New Canaan. And I always say to my kids, it was the worst time of my life, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because basically everything all my bricks had to fall down. And then when I built myself up again, I could look at them and say, okay, is this my brick, or is this a brick someone like imposed
at
on
me.
me. Yeah, you know, like, and so I could build up the foundation of who I am in a much healthier way, and in a way that was more authentic to who I am. And the other great thing about being in a mental hospital, which sounds like a very strange thing to
right.
was that they had us journal.
Okay.
And journaling reminded me that when I was in high school, I wanted to be a writer. And of course, my parents were like, "You'll never make a living as an English major," and they always acknowledged that I was a really good writer, but it was definitely not something I should pursue. So I ended up with
So it's a hobby, it's not a career.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I ended up getting an undergraduate degree in political science, which I'm not really sure why that was more marketable, but yeah. But, and then an MBA in finance, which is probably about as far away from being a writer.
Math and English are the opposite spectrum, right?
I mean, fortunately, I was good at both, but so it really wasn't until I had this breakdown that I realized that I'd been doing everything everyone expected of me for my entire life, and I didn't want to be in my nursing home at the end of my life thinking, what would happen if? So I finally gave myself the permission to write, and I made the secret promise to myself that I was going to get my first book contract for my 40th birthday, present to myself, and I got my first book contract 2 months after my 40th birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
And can I ask who was your first contract with?
That was with Dutton, which is part of
okay.
Penguin. Yeah. So that my first book was published by them, and then my second book and all the rest of my young adult books are with Scholastic, and then my middle grades are with Simon & Schuster.
Okay. And Scholastic really, I mean, that's such a great conduit to bring it to schools.
It is, yes. Particularly like with the book fairs, and it's wonderful. Yeah, I have a wonderful, wonderful editor there. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
And so now a little bit more about Purge. So that's your history. What is the story about? I mean, how does the story progress? How does she resolve? Does she resolve it?
Well, so she also ends up in a psych hospital, and you don't really know throughout the book till almost the end what sort of precipitated her being in there, because the book opens with her in it. But towards the end of the book, you then find out what precipitated it, and you also hear all these other cast of characters who were involved. And one of the things that actually came from my own experience of being in the psych ward was, so because I had been bulimic, even though at that point I was mostly recovered, they put me on an eating disorder protocol, which meant that I had to eat with all the other eating disorder people on the ward. And they were all anorexic. So no one was allowed to start eating until everyone was there, and you weren't allowed to use a napkin, which to me, I was brought up in this very proper home. So not putting a napkin on your lap I put it on my lap because that's what I was brought up to do. And they started yelling at me. And I'm
because you would hide your food there.
Well, because anorexics would hide their food there.
Right.
But what drove me crazy is the one bulimic there, and informed the barfers and the starvers, who are like these two factions in the book, was that I would be starving and want to eat, but I couldn't eat till they came to the table, and they would all be hiding because they didn't want to eat.
Because they didn't want to eat.
Yeah. So,
oh my goodness.
but I mean, people have said to me that it's very unusual to find a book about a serious topic like bulimic that's also funny, but humor is a way that I try and deal with difficult topics. And so while most of my books are pretty serious, but there's always some element of humor.
But I think that's true in life, right? Because they say if you don't laugh, you'll cry.
Exactly.
So sometimes you would laugh at adversity.
And you kind of want to, sometimes it's just you kind of have to laugh because it gets so surreal that,
No, I get that. I get that. So, no, a lot of this has to do with body image. Is there anything that we can do as parents to get kids to focus on what they're good at and not focus on what they look like?
Well, it's really interesting. As part of the research for that book, I read this book called The Body Project by Joan Jacobs Brumberg. And it talks about the history of body body image in the U.S. and how it really wasn't until the last century, well, like sort of, I think the 20th century, where, because in the past they would, yes, people always focus on looks, but like they really would focus more on your deeds than your looks. And then suddenly it became, in particular, I think television and the whole like selfie and social media culture, it became so much more about looks. But it's one of the things that they said to me when I was in treatment was, I kept talking about the dark. I feel like I have this dark hole inside, and the therapist said to me, well, other people can only fill that black hole, like maybe like 10 to 20%. The rest of it's got to come from within. And that was when I allowed myself to be a writer, which is what I'd always wanted to do. That filled the black hole because I could look in the mirror and say, I'm Sarah and I'm a writer. And that's what I've always wanted to do.
And I'm darn good at it, and I help people.
And yeah, exactly. And I had that. It was like discovering my purpose in life, or something that gave me purpose, and sort of made me think about things beyond myself. That really made all the difference.
I love it.
And it's so funny because one of my books, the rights sold in Germany for like a lot more money than I ever thought they would. And my husband took me out to dinner and I raised a glass of wine to heaven. I said, Dad, remember when you told me I wouldn't make a living as an English major? Cheers.
This is the good champagne, and I can afford it, right?
So, I mean, I love my father, and, but it sort of felt good to prove that wrong. And I hope for other young people, like I always say, like try and find a way to make a living out of your passion. Because then I mean, literally this summer I worked for 7 days a week for over a month, writing 2,500 words a day because I had to rewrite my book. And yes, it was not fun. But if I had been on Wall Street, I would never have wanted. I would have just quit. I wouldn't have worked that kind of out.
So you were working hard, but you were working your passion.
Exactly,
and that's what matters.
And that it does, and especially when it's passion that you feel like is a purpose, it makes all the difference when you want to get up in the morning, and you're doing something that you really care about.
And now I'm curious. Your books, I think most of them, all of them, have a female character as a lead. But you mentioned once you went to a school and to address the students, and the teacher or the principal, whatever, said they'd rather have you just address the girls because it's a girl story.
Yes, yeah, you write girl books. Yes,
you write girl books.
Yes,
and to me, I can't imagine that boys are not affected by predators, by eating disorders, by cyberbullying. Goodness knows. And I can't imagine that if J.K. Rowling popped into a school that they'd say to her, oh, you know what, you write books for boys. Most of your characters are boys, right? The main.
Right, yeah.
And they'd only let the boys hear it. So why do you think there's this double standard? Why do you write girl books?
Well, it really drives me crazy. So at that school, fortunately, they didn't do that. She said that, like, she thought about that.
Right.
But I had already talked to 2 sessions of students, like a full cafeteria. And I said to her, first of all, my talks are not, as you see, are not gendered. Like, I'm talking about how you need to write well no matter what career you go into. I talk about research and critical thinking, and, I talk about like how I got sent a letter saying there was a dead body, and like stuff that really interests the kids. So they were really engaged, both boys and girls. But I said to her, what message are you sending to both boys and girls when a male author comes in? You make everybody listen to him, but when a female author comes in, you say, oh well, the boys don't have to listen to her. Like, you are perpetuating sexism, and those boys are going to grow up and they're going to be in the workplace and they're going to think they don't have to listen to their female colleagues. And
because they talk about girl topics.
Exactly. Yes. And so she was like, oh, I never thought of that. And I'm like, you really need to think about that. But it's also, it's also to do with cover art, and I actually wrote a blog post with it. I was very nervous about writing because I didn't want to upset my publisher, but I compared novels written by male authors with a female protagonist, and then covers of novels written by female authors with a female protagonist, and including some at my own publisher.
Right.
And what was interesting was the ones with male authors had a much more muted color palette. And if there was a girl on the cover, she was sort of more usually not a photograph. Whereas my books always have a photograph of a girl on the cover, and they had like a much more like pink or purple, or a very feminine color palette.
So it's actually the publisher that's also pushing this idealism.
Well,
so.
I think they're trying. I mean, I don't think they mean to be sexist, but I called it branding or gendering, and
Right.
I think
and they're gendering your books.
Well, yeah, and I think they thought they were branding me, but I was sort of like,
Not really.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one more question
yeah.
for you because we only have a minute left.
Right.
But I'm dying to know.
Right.
You mentioned that there's a high correlation between creative people and various mental health conditions. How do we make our crazy pay? Can you give just one little tip to people who maybe they're not crazy, but
Right.
but just have a huge desire or huge fear? How do you face that?
You have to, you just have to take that jump, and if you want to write, just write a little bit every day, and start off writing about things that happen. You can start off doing it therapeutically. But then you'll find that it ends up being, more than just therapy, and you can learn to make it pay, because you will be helping other people feel that they're less alone.
And maybe that's the way you were talking about the black hole.
Yes.
You can fill it with your writing,
Right.
Even if it's just a journal, right? Not everyone's going to be as
Right.
successful commercially as you've been.
Right. But part of the reason I've chosen to be very public about the fact that I've suffered from mental illness is it's so important for young people to be able to look and say, look, she has mental illness,
Yeah.
and she's published
And she's doing it.
all these books. Yeah. So they know that they're not alone, and that they can still go on to lead a healthy and happy life.
Wonderful. Well, Sarah Dara Littman, thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
so
us
much for
today
having me.
on A Certain Age. It was great to have you, and I feel like we've learned so much.
Thank you.